My name is Sarah. I'm 42 years old. And 3 months ago, my husband of 18 years looked me in the eye and asked for a divorce. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. He didn't just want out of our marriage. He wanted everything. The house we'd built together. Both cars. Our entire savings account. Even my share of the business I'd helped him start when we had nothing but hope and credit card debt. My lawyer nearly fell out of his chair when I told him I was going to give David everything he asked for. He begged me to fight, pleaded with me to reconsider. But I sat there, calm as still water, and told him to draw up the papers exactly as David requested. If you think this story is worth hearing, hit that like button right now. Subscribe for more real-life stories that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about winning and losing. And comment below to tell me where you're watching from, because what happened next changed my life forever. Everyone thought I'd completely lost my mind. My lawyer, Marcus, a man who'd been practicing family law for 30 years, actually asked me if I needed a psychiatric evaluation. He'd seen desperate people make desperate choices, but he'd never seen someone willingly hand over 18 years of their life without even a token fight. "Sarah, you're destroying your own life," he kept saying, his voice getting higher with each meeting. "This man is taking advantage of your emotional state. You're not thinking clearly." My sister called me crying. My mother drove 4 hours to stage what I can only describe as an intervention. My best friend Janet showed up at my door at 7 in the morning with coffee and a folder full of divorce statistics, trying to convince me that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But here's what none of them understood. I wasn't broken. I wasn't having a breakdown. I wasn't emotionally compromised or thinking irrationally. I was thinking more clearly than I had in years. Every single person in my life was looking at me like I was a wounded animal, limping toward my own destruction, but I kept telling them the same thing over and over again. I know what I'm doing. The pain in their eyes when I said those words, it was almost worse than the pain I felt when David first told me he was leaving. Because they loved me, and they were watching what they thought was my complete surrender to a man who'd already broken my heart. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't fight for what was rightfully mine. But I couldn't explain it to them. Not yet. Not until it was over. David's reaction when I agreed to his demands was telling. He walked into that first mediation session expecting a war. He'd brought his own lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman with a reputation for taking no prisoners in divorce court. He'd prepared for months of bitter negotiations, drawn-out fights over every piece of furniture, every shared memory, every dollar we'd saved together. Instead, I handed him victory on a silver platter. The smugness that spread across his face in that moment, God, it still makes my stomach turn. He actually leaned back in his chair and smiled, like he was savoring the taste of winning. Like my 18 years of devotion, sacrifice, and love meant so little that I'd just give it all away without even trying to keep a piece of it for myself. He looked at his lawyer with this expression of disbelief, as if to say, "Can you believe how easy this is?" And then he looked at me with something I can only describe as pity. Like I was pathetic. Like I was exactly what he'd always thought I was, weak, emotional, unable to think strategically. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" he asked, and there was this condescending tone in his voice that made my skin crawl. "You don't have to give up everything. We can work something out." But even as he said it, I could see the relief in his eyes. He was terrified I might change my mind, that I might suddenly develop some backbone and fight him for half of what we'd built together. He had no idea what he was really taking from me. No idea at all. There was only one person I trusted with the truth. Janet had been my best friend since college. She'd been my maid of honor, had held my hand through 2 miscarriages, had watched me sacrifice my own career ambitions to support David's dreams. If anyone deserved to know what I was really doing, it was her. I asked her to come over on a Tuesday evening, about 2 weeks before the final hearing. David was out of town on business, or so he said. These days, I never knew if his business trips were legitimate or just more opportunities to see whatever woman he was seeing behind my back. Janet sat on my couch, the same couch David would be taking in the divorce, and I spread out the documents on my coffee table. Bank statements, email printouts, financial records, legal documents I'd spent months gathering in secret. "Janet," I said, watching her face carefully, "I need you to see something." As her eyes moved across the papers, I watched understanding dawn on her face like a sunrise. Her mouth fell open. She looked up at me, then back down at the evidence, then up at me again. "Oh my God, Sarah," she whispered. "Does David know you have this?" I shook my head. "And he can't know. Not until it's too late." The relief that washed over her face was so profound that she actually started crying. "You're not giving up," she said. "You're not broken." "No," I said softly. "I'm not broken. I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm devastated. But I'm not broken. And I'm definitely not stupid. See, here's what everyone, including David, didn't understand about me giving him everything. Ownership comes with responsibility. When you own something, you're liable for it. When you control something, you're accountable for what's been done with it. And when you take everything from someone who knows exactly what you've been doing behind their back, well, sometimes the gift you think you're receiving is actually a trap you're walking into. I could have fought David in court. I could have hired my own shark of a lawyer and battled him for every dollar, every asset, every piece of our shared life. And you know what would have happened? He would have been warned. His lawyer would have started asking questions. They would have dug deeper into our finances, looked more carefully at our business records, started covering tracks that I needed to remain exposed. Fighting him would have been the emotional response, the expected response, the response of a wounded woman who wanted revenge more than she wanted justice. But giving him everything? That was strategy. That was chess, not checkers. That was understanding that sometimes the best way to trap a mouse is to leave the cheese exactly where they expect to find it. I need to tell you about who I used to be, before David decided I was disposable. When we met in college, I was studying business administration with a minor in accounting. I had dreams of starting my own company, maybe something in event planning or small business consulting. I was ambitious, driven, the kind of woman who color-coded her planners and finished projects ahead of deadline. David was studying computer science, but he was struggling. Not with the technical aspects. He was brilliant with computers, but with everything else. Organization, time management, understanding how to turn his technical skills into actual income. He was the classic brilliant programmer who couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life. I fell in love with his potential. And more than that, I fell in love with the idea of helping him reach it. After we graduated, I put my own dreams on hold. While David worked on developing software applications, I handled everything else. I managed our finances, filed our taxes, researched business licenses and incorporation paperwork. When he finally launched his first successful app, I was the one who negotiated the contracts, set up the business banking, established the LLC. I was his partner in every sense of the word, but I never put my name on any of the official documents. David said it would be simpler for tax purposes if everything was under his name initially, and we could always add me later once the business was more established. I trusted him. I believed we were building something together, even if the paperwork didn't reflect that reality. When we bought our first house, my name went on the deed alongside his. We were married, and community property laws meant everything was ours together anyway. But the business, that stayed in David's name. Always temporarily. Always until we got established. Always next year. I gave birth to our daughter Emma when the business was just starting to really take off. I'd planned to go back to work after maternity leave, but David convinced me that it made more sense for me to stay home. The business needed more attention than ever, and someone had to manage our household, raise our daughter, handle all the administrative tasks that kept our life running smoothly. "You're so much better at this stuff than I am," he'd tell me. "I need you to handle the business side. I'll focus on the technical development, and you handle everything else." Everything else. Marketing, customer service, accounting, payroll, tax preparation, contract negotiations, plus cooking, cleaning, childcare, and somehow maintaining the illusion that I was a happy housewife who'd found fulfillment in supporting her husband's success. For 15 years, I was the invisible partner in David's business. His name was on the door, but my fingerprints were on every contract, every financial decision, every strategic move that had built his company into something worth fighting over in a divorce. The change in David didn't happen overnight. It was so gradual that I almost didn't notice it at first. It started about 3 years ago, right around the time the business really exploded. We landed a major contract with a tech company that wanted to license David's software for their entire organization. Suddenly, we weren't just comfortable. We were wealthy. David started traveling more. Networking, he called it. Building relationships with potential clients. He'd be gone for days at a time, coming home exhausted and distant, like he was living in a completely different world that I couldn't access. He began talking differently about money, too. It wasn't our savings anymore or our success. It was my company, my clients, my income. When I'd bring up financial decisions or ask about business developments, he'd get irritated. "You don't understand the technical side, Sarah," he'd say. "Just focus on what you're good at." But the thing is, I'd always understood the business side better than he did. I was the one who'd built the systems that made his technical brilliance profitable. I was the one who'd negotiated the contracts that turned his code into income. And now he was acting like I was some secretary who occasionally helped with filing. The real shift started when he hired Marcus Chin as a business advisor. Marcus was everything David wanted to be: smooth, confident, connected in all the right circles. He drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, and spoke about business like it was some kind of high-stakes game that only certain people were smart enough to play. Marcus started filling David's head with ideas about maximizing growth potential and protecting assets from unnecessary liability. He introduced David to other successful entrepreneurs, invited him to exclusive networking events, made him feel like he was finally running in the circles he deserved. And slowly, incrementally, Marcus began suggesting that David's business structure was overly complicated by having a wife who was involved in the day-to-day operations. Successful men protect their assets. I overheard Marcus telling David one evening when they thought I was upstairs putting Emma to bed. "You've got to think about worst-case scenarios. Divorce, lawsuits, business disputes. You want to make sure everything is structured so that your core assets are protected." David started asking me fewer questions about business decisions. He stopped including me in meetings with potential clients. He opened new business accounts that only he had access to. When I asked about these changes, he'd brush me off. "Marcus thinks we need better separation between personal and business finances," he'd say. "It's just more professional this way." Professional. As if our marriage was somehow unprofessional. As if the woman who'd built the foundation of his success was now a liability to be managed rather than a partner to be valued. The discovery came on a Thursday night in January. David was in Chicago for what he told me was a software conference. Emma was at a sleepover at her friend's house. I was alone in our big, beautiful house, feeling more isolated than I'd felt since we were newlyweds struggling to pay rent on our tiny apartment. I'd been handling our personal finances for 18 years, but lately, David had been taking over more and more of that responsibility. "I should probably understand where our money is going," he'd said, as if I'd been hiding something from him instead of meticulously tracking every expense for nearly 2 decades. But I still had access to our main bank accounts. And that night, something made me log in and look at our statements more carefully than I had in months. There were transfers I didn't recognize. Large amounts moving between accounts I'd never heard of. payments to companies that weren't familiar. And there were charges. Charges to hotels in cities where David had supposedly been working alone. Charges to restaurants for amounts that suggested he wasn't dining solo. Charges to jewelry stores for purchases I'd never received. My hands started shaking as I clicked through month after month of statements. This wasn't just infidelity. This was financial betrayal on a scale I couldn't have imagined. I spent the next 4 hours tracing transactions, taking screenshots, printing documents. By 3 in the morning, I had a clear picture of what David had been doing with our money, and it was so much worse than just an affair. He'd been systematically moving assets out of our joint accounts and into business accounts that were solely in his name. He'd been paying for an apartment across town, not just hotel rooms for occasional affairs, but an actual second residence. He'd been making large cash withdrawals that I couldn't trace. And worst of all, he'd been doing it all while having Marcus help him restructure the business to minimize what I'd be entitled to in a divorce. They'd been planning this for months. Maybe years. While I'd been making dinner and helping Emma with homework and maintaining the fiction that we were a happy family, David had been methodically stealing the life we'd built together and preparing to leave me with nothing. But as I sat there in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, surrounded by evidence of my husband's betrayal, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't call him in Chicago and confront him with what I'd found. Instead, I felt something I'd almost forgotten I was capable of feeling: cold, calculating anger. David thought he was so much smarter than me. He thought he could plan my destruction while I remained obliviously grateful for the crumbs of affection he threw my way. He thought I was too trusting, too dependent, too emotionally fragile to see what was happening right in front of me. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. What followed was 3 months of the most careful, methodical investigation I'd ever conducted. I became a detective in my own life. While David traveled and networked and built his exit strategy, I quietly built my understanding of exactly what he'd been doing and how he'd been doing it. I installed monitoring software on our home computer, the same computer David used for business when he worked from home. I learned about keyloggers and email recovery. I discovered that David wasn't nearly as careful about covering his digital tracks as he thought he was. The affair was with Rebecca, Marcus's business partner. She was a divorce attorney, which explained a lot about how sophisticated their planning had become. The two of them had been helping David restructure his assets to make them as difficult as possible for me to claim in a divorce proceeding. But here's what David and his new girlfriend didn't understand about the business they were trying to steal from me. I'd built the systems that made it work. I knew where the bodies were buried because I'd helped bury some of them. Tax deductions that were aggressive. Client payments that had been structured to minimize tax liability in ways that probably wouldn't survive an audit. Business expenses that were actually personal expenses run through company accounts. Payroll classifications that saved money but violated labor laws. None of it was malicious when we'd done it. We were a small business trying to survive in a competitive market, and I'd made financial decisions that saved us money and kept us afloat. David had always trusted my judgment completely, until he decided he didn't want me to be part of his future anymore. But now, all of those creative financial strategies that had built David's wealth were time bombs waiting to explode. And if David took full ownership of the business in our divorce, every single one of those potential problems would become exclusively his responsibility. I spent weeks documenting everything. Not just the evidence of his affair and financial betrayal, but also every business decision that could potentially create legal liability. Every tax strategy that might trigger an audit. Every classification that might violate employment law. I researched the relevant statutes. I consulted anonymously with tax attorneys and business compliance experts. I learned more about corporate liability in 3 months than I'd learned in 15 years of actually running a business. And slowly, a plan began to form. Janet was the only person who knew what I was really doing, and even she thought I'd lost my mind when I explained my strategy. "You're going to let him take everything?" she asked for the 100th time as we sat in my kitchen, going through the timeline I'd created. "Sarah, this is insane. Even if you're right about the business liability, you're still giving up millions of dollars in legitimate assets." "Janet," I said patiently, "what good is fighting for half of something that's about to be worthless?" I showed her the documentation I'd gathered about the business's potential legal exposure, the tax strategies that might not survive scrutiny, the employment classifications that could result in penalties, the business expenses that might be reclassified as personal income. If I fight him for the business, his lawyers are going to dig into every aspect of our finances. They're going to clean up these issues before they become problems. But if I give him everything willingly, if I make it look like I'm too emotional and heartbroken to fight rationally, then he takes full ownership of all the potential liabilities," Janet finished, understanding finally dawning on her face. "Exactly. And there's something else." I pulled out a file I hadn't shown anyone else. "I've been in contact with the IRS." Janet's eyes widened. "Sarah, what did you do?" "I filed a whistleblower complaint about the business's tax strategies. I reported the aggressive deductions, the questionable expense classifications, all of it." I looked at my best friend, whose mouth was now hanging open. "The IRS pays whistleblowers a percentage of any additional taxes they collect as a result of information provided." "How much of a percentage?" "Between 15 and 30% of whatever they recover." Janet stared at me for a long moment. "So you're not just giving David a business with serious legal problems. You're giving him a business that the IRS is already investigating. The investigation won't become public until after our divorce is finalized. By the time David finds out what's coming, it'll be too late for him to do anything about it. He'll own 100% of whatever penalties, back taxes, and legal costs result from 15 years of creative financial management." I could see Janet doing the math in her head. Even a conservative estimate of what the IRS might assess in penalties and back taxes would probably exceed the value of all the legitimate assets I was giving up in the divorce. "But Sarah," she said slowly, "won't you be liable too? You were involved in all those financial decisions." I smiled. "Not if I'm not an owner of the business when the hammer falls. Not if I can show that I was just following my husband's instructions. Not if I'm positioned as a victim of his financial manipulation rather than a willing participant in questionable business practices." The beauty of my plan wasn't just that David would inherit a massive legal and financial problem. It was that he'd inherit it because of his own greed, his own decision to cut me out of the business I'd helped build, his own insistence on taking everything instead of sharing it fairly. He was doing this to himself. I was just letting him. The mediation sessions were performances, and I deserved an Oscar for my acting. Every 2 weeks for 2 months, I sat across from David and his attorney while my lawyer pleaded with me to reconsider my decisions. I played the role of the heartbroken wife who was too devastated to think clearly, too emotional to fight strategically. David grew more confident with each session. He'd arrived at the first mediation prepared for battle, but as it became clear that I wasn't going to fight him for anything, he started treating the proceedings like a formality. His lawyer would present demands, and I would agree to them. My lawyer would object, and I would overrule him. "I just want this to be over," I'd say, dabbing at my eyes with tissues. "I can't handle conflict right now. David can have whatever he wants." The condescension that radiated from David during these sessions was almost unbearable. He'd pat my hand and speak to me in the kind of gentle voice you'd use with a child. "I know this is hard, Sarah," he'd say, "but you're being very mature about this. Very reasonable." Reasonable. As if giving away 18 years of my life was reasonable rather than strategic. His lawyer, Rebecca's associate, would sometimes look at me with what I think was meant to be sympathy. She probably thought she was watching a woman's complete emotional collapse, a textbook example of how infidelity and abandonment could destroy someone's ability to advocate for themselves. My own lawyer, Marcus, grew increasingly frustrated with my refusal to fight. He'd request private conferences where he'd beg me to reconsider, to at least try to negotiate for a fair settlement. "Sarah, you're entitled to half of everything," he'd say. "The house alone is worth over $1 million. The business is worth even more. You're walking away from a fortune." But I'd just shake my head and insist that I needed the divorce to be over quickly and cleanly. I told him I couldn't handle a prolonged battle, that I trusted David to take care of Emma financially, that I just wanted to start over with a clean slate. Meanwhile, David was making plans for his new life with Rebecca. He'd started shopping for a bigger house in a better neighborhood. He was talking about expanding the business, maybe opening a second location. He was planning expensive vacations and investing in luxury items he'd always wanted but we'd never been able to afford. He thought he'd won the lottery. He thought he'd managed to trade in his old life for a better one without any real consequences. He had no idea what was coming. The final hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in April. I woke up before my alarm, as I had every day for the past month. I'd been sleeping better than I had in years, which probably sounds crazy given that I was about to finalize my divorce and give away everything I'd worked for. But there's something peaceful about knowing exactly what's going to happen next. I dressed carefully that morning. Not too formal. I was playing the role of the defeated wife, remember. But not too casual either. I chose a simple navy dress that made me look professional but not threatening, competent but not calculating. Emma was staying with my sister for the week. I'd told her that Mommy and Daddy were finishing their divorce paperwork and that afterwards we'd know exactly what our new life was going to look like. She was 13, old enough to understand that her parents' marriage was over, but not old enough to understand the financial complexities of what was happening. David arrived at the courthouse looking like he'd already won. He was wearing his most expensive suit, the one I'd helped him pick out for the business conference where he'd first met Marcus. Rebecca wasn't with him. That would have been too obvious, but I could see the confidence in his posture, the barely suppressed excitement in his eyes. This was it. The day he'd been planning for months. The day he'd finally be free of his old life and able to start his new one with all the assets and none of the baggage. As we sat in the courtroom waiting for the judge, David actually leaned over to me and whispered, "Thank you for making this easy, Sarah. I know you could have made this much more difficult." I smiled at him. It was probably the most genuine smile I'd given him in months. "I just want what's best for everyone," I whispered back. The judge reviewed our settlement agreement. David would receive full ownership of the business, the house, both cars, and 80% of our liquid assets. I would receive a small settlement that would cover my immediate living expenses and help with Emma's education costs. "Mrs. Patterson," the judge said, looking at me seriously, "I have to ask if you're comfortable with these terms. This settlement is unusually generous to your husband. Are you sure you don't want additional time to reconsider?" I stood up, smoothed my dress, and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, I'm comfortable with these terms. I just want to move forward with my life." David's lawyer presented the paperwork for final signatures. David signed first, with a flourish that was probably visible from the back of the courtroom. Then it was my turn. I took the pen and signed my name on every page, transferring ownership of everything we'd built together to the man who'd betrayed me, cheated on me, and tried to leave me with nothing. But as I signed that last page, I wasn't thinking about what I was losing. I was thinking about what David was about to inherit. The knock on David's office door came exactly 6 days after our divorce was finalized. I wasn't there to see it, of course. But Janet had become friendly with David's secretary during all those years when I was actively involved in the business, and she still heard things through the office gossipy vine. David was in his office, probably planning his next expansion or shopping online for furniture for the bigger house he was buying, when his secretary buzzed him. "Mr. Patterson? There are some people here from the IRS who'd like to speak with you." I've imagined that moment 1,000 times. The way David's face must have changed. The way his stomach must have dropped. The way he must have tried to quickly calculate what this could possibly be about. His new lawyer, not the divorce attorney, but the business attorney he'd hired after Marcus suggested he needed better legal representation for his expanded operations, was in the meeting. I heard that the lawyer whispered something to David that made him go completely pale. I don't know exactly what those 5 words were, but based on what happened next, I can guess. This is a criminal investigation. The IRS agents were polite but thorough. They had a warrant to search business records going back 7 years. They had questions about expense classifications, payroll structures, and tax deductions that had been flagged for review. David tried to maintain his composure, tried to act like a successful businessman who had nothing to hide. But according to Janet's contact, his hands were shaking as he showed the agents to the filing cabinets. The agents spent 6 hours in the office that first day. They copied files, took computer hard drives, interviewed employees. And by the time they left, everyone who worked for David knew that his business was under serious federal investigation. That evening, David called me for the first time since our divorce was finalized. "Sarah," he said, and I could hear the panic in his voice trying to hide behind false calm. Do you know anything about an IRS investigation?" I was sitting in my new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom place across town where Emma and I were building our new life together. I had been reading a book, enjoying the quiet peace of not having to wonder who David was texting or where he was really going. "An IRS investigation?" I said, injecting just the right amount of confusion into my voice. "Into what?" "Into the business. Into my business practices. David, you know I never really understood all the tax stuff. That was always your area." There was a long pause. I could practically hear him trying to figure out how to ask what he really wanted to know without actually admitting what he was worried about. "Sarah, when you were handling the books, were there any decisions you made that might have been questionable?" "I always did exactly what you told me to do," I said truthfully. "You were the business owner. You made all the decisions." "I just filed the paperwork the way you instructed." Another long pause. Then, in a voice so small I almost couldn't hear it, "Oh God, Sarah. What did we do?" I said. "David, you've been very clear that the business was entirely yours. You fought for full ownership in our divorce, remember? You convinced the judge that I was just a housewife who occasionally helped with administrative tasks." The silence that followed was so complete I thought the call had been disconnected. "David," I said. "Are you still there?" "I have to go," he said, and hung up. What followed was a complete public collapse of everything David had thought he'd won. The IRS investigation became public within a week. Local business journalists picked up the story. Successful local entrepreneur under federal investigation for tax evasion. David's biggest clients started asking questions about the stability of his company. Rebecca, his attorney girlfriend who'd been so instrumental in planning his divorce strategy, suddenly became very busy with other clients. When David needed legal representation for the federal investigation, she referred him to a criminal defense attorney and wished him luck. The beautiful house he'd been planning to buy with his divorce windfall became an impossible dream as his business income evaporated overnight. Clients canceled contracts. Employees started looking for other jobs. The company that David had thought was worth millions became a liability he couldn't afford to maintain. But the real masterpiece of justice came when the IRS finished their audit. 15 years of aggressive tax strategies. 15 years of business expenses that should have been classified as personal income. 15 years of payroll decisions that violated federal labor laws. It all added up to a tax bill that exceeded $2 million, before penalties and interest. David tried to negotiate. He hired the best tax attorneys he could afford, which wasn't very good anymore since his business had collapsed. He tried to argue that many of the questionable decisions had been made by his ex-wife, who had handled the books for most of the company's existence. But the IRS wasn't interested in his marital problems. As far as they were concerned, David was the owner of the business and therefore responsible for all business decisions, regardless of who had actually implemented them. His divorce decree, which gave him full ownership of the company, made him fully liable for all the company's obligations, including the massive tax bill that was about to destroy him financially. 6 months after our divorce, David lost everything. The house, our beautiful family home where Emma had grown up, went into foreclosure. The business that had been his pride and joy closed permanently. The cars were repossessed. The savings accounts were emptied to pay lawyers and partial settlements with the IRS. David declared bankruptcy, but even that didn't save him from the criminal charges that followed the civil investigation. Tax evasion, employment law violations, wire fraud related to some of the business contracts he'd misrepresented. He ended up pleading guilty to federal charges and serving 18 months in minimum security prison. When he was released, he was a convicted felon with no assets, no business, and no prospects for rebuilding any kind of meaningful income. Rebecca was long gone by then, of course. Successful attorneys don't stay with convicted felons who can't afford to pay their own legal bills. Meanwhile, I received a check from the IRS for $347,000, my whistleblower reward for providing information that led to the recovery of unpaid taxes. It was more money than I'd walked away with in the divorce settlement, and I'd earned it by simply being honest about business practices I'd helped implement. Emma and I used that money to buy a small house in a good school district. Nothing fancy, nothing ostentatious. Just a clean, safe place where we could build a new life based on honesty instead of deception, simplicity instead of greed. I went back to school and finished the business degree I'd abandoned 20 years earlier to support David's dreams. I started a consulting company helping small businesses navigate tax compliance and financial management, using my hard-earned expertise in what not to do. Emma adjusted to our new life with remarkable resilience. She visited her father when he was allowed visitors, and I never spoke badly about him in front of her. But she was old enough to understand that sometimes people make choices that have consequences, and that those consequences aren't anyone else's responsibility to fix. Looking back now, I understand that people think I'm some kind of criminal mastermind who destroyed my ex-husband out of spite. That's not what happened. I didn't plant evidence. I didn't lie to investigators. I didn't sabotage David's business or frame him for crimes he didn't commit. Every single business decision that ultimately destroyed David's company was a decision we made together when we were building that company. Every tax strategy that created liability was a strategy one implemented at his direction when we were trying to maximize our profits. Every questionable practice that led to federal charges was a practice he approved when it was saving us money. The only thing I did was make sure that when our marriage ended, David took full ownership of the consequences of all the decisions we'd made together. I could have warned him. When I first discovered the scope of his betrayal, I could have confronted him and given him a chance to clean up the business practices before they became legal problems. I could have insisted on sharing ownership of the company in our divorce, which would have meant sharing the liability when the IRS came calling. But David didn't want a partner anymore. He wanted full ownership of what we'd built together. He wanted all the assets and none of the baggage. He wanted to cut me out of the rewards while leaving me vulnerable to all the risks. So I gave him exactly what he asked for. Full ownership. Full control. Full responsibility. The fact that full responsibility included responsibility for years of questionable business practices wasn't something I created. It was something that already existed, something David would have had to deal with eventually regardless of whether our marriage survived. I just made sure he had to deal with it alone. Some people call it revenge. I call it justice. David spent 18 years taking my contributions for granted. He spent months planning to leave me with nothing while he started fresh with his new girlfriend. He was willing to destroy our family, betray our marriage, and steal the wealth we'd built together. but he wasn't willing to take responsibility for the business practices that had built that wealth. He wanted all the rewards and none of the risks. He wanted to be seen as the brilliant entrepreneur who'd created $1 million company, but he didn't want to acknowledge that the company had been built on tax strategies that pushed legal boundaries. When David made the decision to pursue full ownership of our business in the divorce, he wasn't just taking what belonged to me. He was also accepting full liability for everything that business represented, both the assets and the obligations. I didn't create those obligations. We created them together over 15 years of running a small business in a competitive market. But when David decided he didn't want me to be his partner anymore, he also decided that those obligations would become entirely his responsibility. That was his choice, his decision, his strategy for maximizing his wealth while minimizing what I could claim in our divorce. The fact that his strategy backfired isn't my fault. It's the natural consequence of trying to have it both ways, claiming full ownership of assets while denying the liability that comes with ownership. Today, Emma is 16 and thriving in her new school. She's on the debate team and maintains a 4.0 GPA. She's never asked me why I didn't fight harder to keep our old house or maintain our old lifestyle. I think she understands, even if she's never said it directly, that sometimes losing everything material is the price of keeping your integrity intact. David is working as a customer service representative for a tech support company. It's honest work, and I genuinely hope he's found some peace in it. He pays child support when he can, which isn't often, but Emma doesn't seem to resent him for it. She sees him every other weekend, and they've built a relationship based on who he is now rather than who he used to be. I run a successful consulting business helping small companies navigate financial compliance issues. My clients appreciate working with someone who understands the temptations of aggressive tax strategies and the importance of staying within legal boundaries. My rates are fair, my advice is solid, and my reputation is built on the kind of integrity I should have insisted on 20 years ago. I'm not wealthy anymore. I drive a used car and live in a modest house. I buy my clothes at Target instead of department stores. Emma and I vacation at state parks instead of resorts. But I sleep peacefully every night knowing that everything I have was earned honestly. I look at myself in the mirror every morning and recognize the woman staring back at me. I've never again had to wonder who my partner is texting or where he's really traveling. The lesson in all of this isn't about revenge or getting even with people who hurt you. The lesson is about understanding that integrity isn't just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest with yourself about what you're willing to accept, what you're willing to compromise, and what you're willing to fight for. For 18 years, I accepted being invisible in my own marriage. I compromised my own ambitions to support someone else's dreams. I fought to maintain a relationship with a man who saw me as useful rather than valuable. When David finally showed me exactly how little I meant to him, I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to be in response. I could have become bitter and vindictive. I could have fought him publicly and tried to destroy his reputation out of spite. Instead, I chose to be strategic. I chose to let David's own greed and dishonesty create the consequences that ultimately held him accountable for his choices. Sometimes winning looks like losing. Sometimes the smartest move is to let someone else think they've beaten you. Sometimes justice takes longer to arrive than you'd like, but it arrives exactly when it's supposed to. I gave David everything he asked for in our divorce. And in doing so, I gave him exactly what he deserved, full ownership of the consequences of his own actions. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice and consequences and what real strength looks like, hit that like button. Comment below and tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest. Was it the betrayal? The investigation? The moment when David realized what he'd really inherited? I read every single comment, and I'm always amazed by the insights and experiences people share. And if you want to hear more stories about real people navigating the messiest, most complicated moments of their lives, subscribe to this channel. These aren't made-up fairy tales or Hollywood fantasies. These are true stories about what happens when ordinary people find extraordinary strength in the worst moments of their lives. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just stepping back and letting someone's own choices create exactly the life they've earned. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for understanding that sometimes what looks like weakness is actually the strongest thing you can do. And thank you for believing that justice, even when it takes longer than we'd like, eventually finds a way to balance the scales. My name is Sarah. I'm 42 years old. And I learned that sometimes the best way to win is to make sure your opponent gets exactly what they asked for.